What if I told you there's a presence within you, an invisible force shaping your every decision, your deepest fears, and your greatest longings, even if you believe you're entirely free? This isn't a ghost story, but it's just as haunting and far more personal. It's the echo of the first and most powerful relationship of your life, the one with your mother. Whether she lives oceans away, whether her body rests in the ground, or even if you haven't exchanged a word in decades, her presence remains indelibly etched, not just in your fleeting memories, but in the very architecture of your psyche. The renowned thinker Shi Heng Yi sounded a profound warning about this force, identifying it as one of the most feared yet most formative influences in human development, the mother complex. You might think you've outgrown her influence, moved on, or even healed from past hurts, but the startling truth is, she's still there, intricately woven into the fabric of your being. This isn't simply about the woman who raised you, it's about the potent inner image, the deep emotional imprint she left behind, an invisible current that continues to sculpt your choices, modulate your voice, define your relationships, and narrate the very story you believe about yourself. And until you consciously understand and engage with this inner mother, you risk living a life that isn't entirely your own, repeating patterns you don't understand, and missing out on the profound, soul-deep freedom that comes from true self-knowledge. Shi Heng Yi termed this pervasive psychic residue the shadow mother, not the nurturing face presented to the world, but the accumulation of unmet needs, silent expectations, and even ancestral pain. Herein lies a truth as painful as it is liberating. You will never fully heal, never truly step into your own sovereign power until you face her. Not the outer mother, the physical person, but the one who still resides, powerfully and often silently, within you. For many, this inner territory where the mother image dwells is both sacred and terrifying. It's a landscape guarded by powerful emotions and deeply ingrained beliefs. Shi Heng Yi himself wrote, "Nothing has a stronger influence psychologically on their environment, and especially on their children, than the unlived life of the parent." Consider the weight of that statement. When you unconsciously carry your mother's unresolved pain, her unspoken shame, her stifled silence, or her lingering sorrow, you become entangled in a life that, in many ways, is not your own. You might find yourself living as her echo, her protector, or an unconscious extension of her unfulfilled dreams and unhealed wounds. In this entanglement, your own unique soul, your authentic essence, begins to dim, overshadowed by the needs and narratives of another. This exploration isn't about casting blame or reopening old wounds for the sake of accusation. Instead, it's a profound and urgent call to return to yourself, to reclaim those precious parts of you that were never fully nurtured, to finally honor the grief your inner child was perhaps never allowed to feel, and to consciously set down the emotional weight you were never meant to carry. We are not here to point fingers. We are here to light candles in the darkest, most forgotten corners of your psyche, because true, lasting freedom doesn't bloom from resentment towards the mother figure in your life. It blossoms from the courageous, conscious act of facing the mother who lives within you. Prepare yourself, for in the journey ahead, we will delve deep into the often forbidden, unacknowledged corners of your psyche, moving beyond superficial heartbreak, beyond the defenses of the ego, and into the alchemical process of psychological death and rebirth that truly begins the moment you finally decide to understand, integrate, and, in a symbolic sense, let go of the restrictive aspects of her internalized influence. You are about to discover why your healing may have felt stuck, how the mother wound has insidiously shaped your identity, and how the profound teachings inspired by thinkers like Shi Heng Yi offer a path not just to survival, but to sovereignty. The truth is simple, though not easy. You are allowed to leave the role of the child. You are allowed to stop carrying the sorrow that is not yours. You are allowed to rewrite the myth. And it begins with one terrifying yet ultimately liberating act of courage, facing the mother in your mind. Let's begin. Now, when we delve into the psychology inspired by thinkers like Shi Heng Yi, the image of the mother expands far beyond the individual woman who gave you life. She takes on a much grander, almost mythical dimension, occupying a primordial seat in the very architecture of what Shi Heng Yi called the collective unconscious. This isn't just your personal mother. This is a timeless, transpersonal image, an energetic pattern encoded into the very soul of humanity. To Shi Heng Yi, the mother is, first and foremost, an archetype, a universal psychic pattern that we inherit rather than invent. It's a force that emerges again and again, powerfully and mysteriously, in our dreams, in ancient myths, in art, and in the intricate dynamics of our personal relationships. She is not just personal, she is, in a profound sense, eternal. This mother archetype inherently carries a dual face, a fascinating and often bewildering paradox. She is the life giver, the ultimate source of nourishment and comfort, but she can also be the life devourer, the one who smothers and restricts. She is the nurturer, but also potentially the one who engulfs. This is what Shi Heng Yi identified as the paradox of the Great Mother, an image far older than civilization itself, representing both the profound safety of the womb and the terrifying danger of being consumed, the boundless creativity of life and the stark finality of destruction, the deep comfort of belonging and the overwhelming fear of engulfment. It's crucial to understand that this powerful archetype is not strictly bound to the historical identity of your biological mother. It lives beneath it, influencing it, and being influenced by it. You can see its echoes in revered religious icons, in the potent symbols of nature, in the grand narratives of mythology, and even in our connection or disconnection to the earth herself. The mother, in this archetypal sense, is both the one who feeds you, sustains you, and offers unconditional love, and simultaneously the one who, if her energies are distorted or unintegrated, threatens to consume your individuality. For those of us carrying unresolved wounds from our interactions with our personal mothers, this powerful archetype becomes inextricably entangled with our personal trauma. Shi Heng Yi warned that when we unconsciously confuse our personal mother with the archetypal mother, we can find ourselves lost in a psychic labyrinth, endlessly reenacting childhood pain through our adult relationships. We might yearn desperately for nurturing, yet be terrified of true closeness, constantly seek approval while simultaneously fearing rejection and abandonment. When this archetype is split within our psyche, when we can only see the good mother or the bad mother and fail to integrate her paradoxical nature, it produces significant psychological distortion, coloring our entire perception of the world and ourselves. The powerful dual nature of the mother archetype, as explored by Shi Heng Yi, vividly appears in the landscape of our inner worlds, particularly in our dreams and in the timeless stories of myth. In dreams, the mother figure might manifest as a gentle, protective guardian, a source of wisdom and comfort, offering solace and guidance. Conversely, she can appear as a monstrous, devouring figure, a terrifying entity that pursues, traps, or consumes the dreamer. These aren't just random images, they are symbolic representations of the psyche grappling with this fundamental, paradoxical force. In mythology, this duality is personified in countless figures. She is Demeter, the grieving mother who withholds life from the earth, and she is Kali, the fierce goddess of destruction and creation. She is the gentle, nurturing Mary, and she is the vengeful Medea. Shi Heng Yi described this inherent ambivalence as the bipolar nature of the mother archetype. She is at once good and evil, creator and destroyer, holy and profane, light and shadow. The psychological challenge arises when our psyche clings desperately to one side of this polarity while fiercely repressing the other. We then fragment our own experience and our understanding of this profound force. To exclusively idealize the mother, to see her only as perfectly good, nurturing, and selfless, is to deny her shadow, her human limitations, and the very real pain she may have caused, even unintentionally. Conversely, to demonize her, to cast her solely as the villain, the source of all our suffering, is to reject her light, the genuine love or care she may have offered, and the life she gave. Either way, by clinging to one extreme, we fall into the trap of projection. We begin casting our unhealed inner wounds, our unmet needs, and our distorted perceptions of the mother archetype onto others, our partners, our mentors, our bosses, even spiritual teachers. Any figure who consciously or unconsciously carries the symbolic weight of mother for us. And this, Shi Heng Yi pointed out, is precisely why so many people remain stuck in cycles of emotional pain and relational dysfunction. True, deep healing of the mother wound cannot occur at the surface level of simply blaming or forgiving the personal mother. Shi Heng Yi insisted that we must move beyond our personal grievances and develop a symbolic vision. When we view our mother only through the narrow, painful lens of our childhood experiences, her neglect, her rage, her control, her absence, we remain trapped in the ego's limited story, forever the wounded child. But a profound shift becomes possible when we begin to see her also as a vessel, a conduit for these ancient, archetypal forces. When we recognize that our personal pain, while unique and valid, is also connected to these larger universal patterns of the mother archetype, we open the door to deep, lasting transformation. It's about understanding that the struggles we faced with our mother are often echoes of struggles that have played out for generations within her own life and the lives of those who came before. Shi Heng Yi offered a profound and often unsettling insight when he stated, "The greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents." This concept is especially potent when considering the mother-child dyad, as it is often through the mother, the primary caregiver in early life, that this unlived life is most directly and intensely passed down. Imagine her unspoken shame, her stifled silence, her unexpressed grief, her unfulfilled dreams, her hidden anxieties. All these powerful emotional energies don't simply vanish. Instead, they can become an invisible yet deeply felt psychic inheritance for the child. The mother complex, a term Shi Heng Yi used to describe the cluster of emotionally charged ideas, memories, and perceptions associated with the mother, takes root when the mother's internal emotional reality becomes deeply internalized by the child. This isn't just about remembering events, it's about the child's psyche becoming a mirror, reflecting and absorbing the mother's emotional state, often without any conscious understanding. For instance, a child who experiences consistent emotional neglect, whose needs for connection and validation are repeatedly unmet, may internalize the profound and painful belief, "I am unworthy of love," or "my needs don't matter." Similarly, a child who is smothered by an overbearing or anxious mother, whose every move is controlled and whose attempts at independence are met with disapproval or fear, may internalize the crippling belief, "I am not allowed to be separate, I am not allowed to be free, my autonomy is a threat." These deeply ingrained voices, these core beliefs, do not simply vanish with age or physical separation. They become the persistent, often unconscious, inner monologue of the adult. This inner voice continues to dictate how you see your worth, how you feel about your body, the confidence or lack thereof in your voice, your capacity to give and receive love, your sense of belonging in the world, and ultimately, your ability to thrive. Unless these powerful inner images and their accompanying emotional charges are made conscious, brought into the light of awareness, the individual will unconsciously and often compulsively seek resolution for these old wounds externally. They might chase it in romantic partners, hoping to finally find the unconditional love they missed. They might pursue it relentlessly in career success, striving for an external validation that can never quite fill the inner void. They might even engage in spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid the messy, painful work of confronting these deep-seated emotional patterns. But the root of the wound, the internalized mother complex, remains untouched, silently influencing from the depths. The wound continues to whisper its insidious message. You are still not enough. You are still lacking. Shi Heng Yi taught that the mother wound is not just a personal tragedy, a private sorrow confined to one individual's life story. It is, in many ways, a collective inheritance, a psychic pattern that is passed down through generations, almost like an emotional DNA. Mothers, often unknowingly and certainly without malicious intent, can transmit their own unhealed pain, their own repressions, their own disconnection from the healthy feminine principle, that inherent capacity for nurturing, intuition, and creative flow to their children. And the children, in turn, unless they awaken to these unconscious dynamics, will often carry these burdens forward, perpetuating the cycle into the next generation. This continues until one day, someone, perhaps you, reading this now, finds the immense courage to turn inward, to face the internalized mother image, and to declare with profound conviction, this story, this pattern of pain, ends with me. Or, for Shi Heng Yi, healing the mother wound was never about trying to change the actual external mother. It wasn't about forcing her to apologize, to understand, or to become the mother you always wished she had been. Instead, the true work, the transformative work, lies in transforming your relationship to the inner mother, that complex, deeply embedded web of associations, emotions, memories, beliefs, and projections that lives deep within your psyche. And make no mistake, this inner work is not small or insignificant. It is sacred, vital, and profoundly liberating. Because until you consciously confront this inner image, until you understand its origins and its ongoing influence, real, lasting transformation simply cannot begin. The mother, in her archetypal essence, is also inextricably linked to earth, to nature, to the vast, mysterious realm of the unconscious itself. When we are disconnected from the healthy, integrated mother within, we often find ourselves simultaneously disconnected from the natural world, from the wisdom of our own bodies, from the subtle whispers of our intuition, and from the profound mystery of the unknown. We might find ourselves fearing the dark, both literally and metaphorically. We may become afraid of truly feeling our emotions, preferring to numb or suppress them. We might over-identify with the rationale, the logical, the masculine aspects of being, seeking control and predictability above all else. And in doing so, Shi Heng Yi suggested, we lose the incredible richness, depth, and vitality of the soul. The cost of remaining blind to the influence of the archetypal mother, particularly her unintegrated or wounded aspects, is truly profound. It can manifest as chronic anxiety, a persistent low-grade hum of unease that colors everyday life. It can show up as unresolved grief, a sorrow that lingers for years, often without a clear understanding of its source. It can lead to persistent relational dysfunction, repeating patterns of conflict, disappointment, or emotional unavailability in partnerships. It can manifest as creative blocks, a stifling of that innate human urge to express and bring forth newness. It can result in a pervasive spiritual emptiness, a feeling of being adrift, and a constant aching sense of not truly belonging to yourself, of not being at home in your own skin. Shi Heng Yi saw this as a kind of psychological epidemic, particularly in modern societies. A generation adrift from its ancestral roots, disconnected from the feminine depths, and estranged from the Great Mother, who births not only bodies but also souls. So here we stand at a crucial threshold. The invitation before you is profound. Can you begin to see your mother not only as the woman who may have hurt you, who may have fallen short of your needs, but also as a doorway, a conduit into the ancient psychic forces and generational patterns that shaped her? Can you start to recognize the powerful archetype of the mother moving through her and consequently moving through you? Can you hold the complexity of her human flaws and the very real pain you experienced without collapsing into endless blame, or conversely, into a blind idolization that denies your own truth? This is not about offering absolution or excusing harmful behavior. It is about liberation, your liberation. Because as Shi Heng Yi's work implies, until you can see the mother image clearly, not just as mother the person, but as mirror, reflecting these deeper archetypal dynamics and your own internalized responses, you will likely continue to walk in circles, repeating old patterns. Your healing will remain shallow, touching only the surface of the wound. Your insights, however intelligent, will not penetrate the deep, unconscious layers where the true transformation needs to occur. But when you bravely face the archetypal mother as she truly is, vast, mysterious, paradoxical, encompassing both light and shadow, something extraordinary begins to happen. You no longer desperately seek love, approval, or healing from her shadow, from the parts of her that were wounded or incapable of giving what you needed. Instead, you return to the root, to the source of your own being. You begin, finally, and perhaps for the first time, to truly become yourself, independent of her unresolved issues and free from the unconscious entanglements of the past. Within the intricate landscape of the psyche, as understood through a Shi Heng Yi inspired lens, the shadow mother represents one of the most feared, misunderstood, and yet profoundly important inner forces we can encounter. Unlike the purely nurturing, life-giving aspect of the maternal archetype, the shadow mother is not the idealized figure who consistently protects, nourishes, or wisely guides. Instead, she embodies the aspect that, when its energy is distorted or unacknowledged, consumes, clings, suffocates, manipulates, and ultimately inhibits the healthy growth and unfolding of the individual soul. She appears in our most unsettling dreams, in the dark undercurrents of ancient myths, and in the quiet, often unspoken despair of adult life as the force that, however subtly, seeks to keep us small, dependent, and enmeshed. Shi Heng Yi observed that this devouring, consuming aspect is not some strange anomaly or a sign of pure evil. Rather, it is an inescapable pole, an inherent part of the archetype itself. The Great Mother, in her full paradoxical power, both births and devours. She creates life, and she also withholds it or reabsorbs it. And when this shadowy, consuming aspect is not consciously faced, integrated, and understood, it can transform into a formidable psychic prison, an invisible cage from which the ego, the conscious sense of self, struggles, often in vain, to escape. The shadow mother shows up vividly in mythology. She is the grieving Demeter refusing to release Persephone from the underworld, keeping her daughter bound to the realm of shadows. She is the dragon fiercely guarding sacred treasure, preventing access to something precious. She is the ancient goddesses who, in their darker aspects, swallow their own offspring, symbolizing the way maternal energy, when unchecked, can stifle the very life it created. Psychologically, this shadow mother emerges when maternal energy overreaches its natural healthy bounds. It's when love, a beautiful and necessary force, twists into control. It's when protection, initially offered for safety, morphs into possessiveness that stifles autonomy. It's when care, a fundamental human need, disguises a deeper, often unconscious dependency, either the mother's dependency on the child or the child's cultivated dependency on the mother. In these moments, the child doesn't feel securely held and nurtured. They feel consumed, their individuality subtly or overtly eroded. And yet, because this consuming energy is often wrapped in the socially acceptable language of maternal concern, "I just want what's best for you. I'm only doing this because I love you," the child often cannot name the betrayal, the subtle violation of their emerging self. The child's soul, in response, often collapses inward, silently absorbing the toxic belief that their freedom is equivalent to abandonment, or that their burgeoning autonomy is an act of betrayal against the mother. As Shi Heng Yi's insights suggest, this powerful, often insidious force of the shadow mother rarely enters our conscious awareness in obvious, easily identifiable ways. Its grip is subtle, frequently hidden beneath layers of societal conditioning, familial loyalty, and inherited, often irrational, guilt. In adult life, its presence may manifest as a crippling, pervasive self-doubt, a persistent inner critic whose voice eerily echoes the mother's disapproving or anxious tones from childhood. It might show up as an inexplicable inability to feel safe, secure, or competent when attempting to be independent or to make autonomous choices. It can reveal itself in a reflexive, almost instinctual fear of disappointing others, especially authority figures or those who unconsciously carry the projection of the mother. Furthermore, It can lead to an unconscious yet powerful attraction to romantic partners who control, diminish, or suffocate, thereby mirroring the emotional terrain of the original mother wound, creating a painful yet familiar psychic landscape. Consider the profound, often paralyzing guilt that can arise the very moment you try to set a healthy boundary, to speak your authentic truth, or to walk away from a dysfunctional relationship or situation. In that instant, the shadow mother within whispers her chilling accusations. You are ungrateful. You are bad. You are selfish for prioritizing your own needs. This is the voice of psychological infantilization, a state Shi Heng Yi warned against, where the ego remains small, underdeveloped, and emotionally dependent, tethered to the mother's internalized expectations and desires. You might physically move cities, change your name, or even live across oceans, and yet still hear her critical or anxious voice in your head before you dare to speak your mind, before you take a risk, before you allow yourself to truly live a life aligned with your own soul's calling. This isn't about physical distance, it's about a deep, energetic entanglement. The ego in such cases remains a perpetual child, forever orbiting the mother's gravitational pull, terrified to step out of line, to deviate from the unspoken rules of the family system. Shi Heng Yi once said that the psyche often prefers the known hell to the unknown heaven. And the shadow mother, for many, represents that known hell, familiar, predictable, and in a deeply twisted way, falsely comforting. People often stay enmeshed in toxic dynamics, not because they consciously enjoy suffering, but because that suffering, however painful, preserves the psychic bond, the familiar connection, however fraught. In this distorted reality, pain can become a strange form of loyalty, and self-betrayal can masquerade as love. Until this deeply ingrained pattern is brought into the light of conscious awareness, individuals will often continue recreating the same painful conditions in their lives, believing they are choosing freely, when in fact they are unconsciously acting out the ancient, powerful myth of the devouring mother, forever caught in her grip. And what is the mother's, particularly the shadow mother's, most powerful and insidious tool for maintaining this psychic control? Shi Heng Yi would likely point to guilt, not the healthy, constructive guilt that arises from a genuine moral failure and guides us toward correction and reparation, but a far more primordial, irrational, and inherited guilt. This is the deep-seated, often unconscious fear that to separate, to individuate, to become truly oneself is somehow to die or to cause a catastrophic loss. Shi Heng Yi described this as a kind of psychic leash, forged not from logic or reason, but from ancient, archetypal fear. The inner voice, saturated with this guilt, whispers, "I am bad if I walk away from her needs or expectations. I am betraying her if I become truly myself, if my happiness doesn't depend on her." This guilt is ancient, resonating with the primal terror of exile, the deeply embedded fear of losing the container of life itself, the connection to the one who first gave us life. Under the immense weight of this unexamined guilt, many individuals remain psychically frozen, unconsciously sabotaging their own joy, suppressing their authentic truth, and collapsing before every significant act of self-assertion or boundary setting. But here lies a profound paradox that Shi Heng Yi's teachings illuminate. The shadow mother is not just the jailer, the force that restricts and imprisons. She is also, in a very real sense, the gatekeeper of the soul's deepest treasures. She is the mythical dragon that guards the precious gold of our authentic self. She is the monster we must face, not to destroy, but to retrieve our own name, our own power, our own unique essence. The very pain she causes, the suffering she seems to inflict is not meaningless. It is, in fact, an initiation. In countless myths, the hero or heroine must confront this formidable, often terrifying, maternal or monstrous feminine figure, not to annihilate her, but to reclaim what she holds hostage: the right to exist fully, to feel deeply, to create authentically, to choose consciously. Integration, not annihilation, is the ultimate task when dealing with the shadow mother. It's about understanding her, acknowledging her power, and reclaiming the parts of ourselves that have been suppressed or distorted by her influence. To undertake this challenging yet crucial work of integration, Shi Heng Yi might encourage a method akin to active imagination, a conscious, intentional inner dialogue with the devouring aspect of the mother that resides within your own psyche. This isn't about literally talking to your external mother about these deep-seated issues. Though that might be appropriate in some contexts, it's not the primary focus here. Instead, it's an internal process. You visualize her within your mind's eye. You allow yourself to speak to this inner figure, this shadow mother. You give voice to the rage that has been suppressed for so long, the profound sorrow, the deep sense of betrayal or abandonment. You let the abandoned, unheard inner child finally speak its truth. And, just as importantly, you create space to let her speak back within this inner dialogue. What are her fears? What are her own wounds? What is the source of her need to control or consume? Through this courageous, honest engagement, you come face to face not with a purely evil entity, but often with a deeply wounded archetypal force, a power that has been distorted by generations of fear, shame, unlived longing, and unprocessed pain. When this profound inner process is undertaken with sincerity and commitment, something fundamental begins to shift. The internalized shadow mother starts to lose her suffocating grip. The inner child, feeling seen and heard, begins to stand a little taller to reclaim its own space. The psyche begins to remember at a deep cellular level that it belongs to itself, not to the unresolved issues of the mother. This confrontation is, in essence, a psychological death and rebirth. It is the symbolic death of the dependent, enmeshed child, the one who lived in fear or constant striving for approval. And it is the birth of the sovereign adult, the one who can stand in their own truth, even if it means disappointing others. Shi Heng Yi might warn that this phase of profound inner change is often accompanied by a period of collapse, of feeling lost, of depression, emptiness, and overwhelming grief. But this crumbling is sacred. It is the necessary dismantling of inherited illusions, the shedding of a false self. The ego, stripped of its old defenses and familiar roles, feels naked, vulnerable, but for the first time, it is authentically real. And it is precisely from this darkness, this fertile void, that true light can return, not a borrowed light reflected from others or dependent on external validation, but the soul's own intrinsic, inextinguishable fire. So let us be unequivocally clear. The shadow mother, this challenging inner figure, is not ultimately your enemy. She is your threshold. She is the terrible teacher, the fierce, uncompromising face of the feminine that demands you awaken from your slumber, that you shed your illusions, and that you claim your own life. And when you dare to confront her, not to blame her endlessly or to remain a victim of her influence, but to courageously reclaim yourself from her unconscious grip, you open the door to a profound and lasting freedom. You begin to live, not as a perpetual child desperately trying to please or appease, but as a sovereign adult who consciously chooses their path, their values, their relationships. You rise, not in bitter defiance of the mother, but in deep honor of what she, perhaps, could never complete in her own life, and in honor of your own soul's imperative to grow. This journey of confronting and integrating the shadow mother is not just personal healing, confined to your individual experience. It is, in a very real sense, ancestral liberation. It is the courageous act of breaking a psychic chain that may have bound your family line for generations. It is a return to the soul, a reclaiming of your innate wholeness. And for those brave enough to walk this often arduous path, the ultimate reward is not a life of constant ease or superficial happiness, but something far more profound and enduring: wholeness. And wholeness, in the eyes of a wisdom tradition like that which Shi Heng Yi might represent, is the rarest, most precious, and most powerful gift of all. Within the vast, intricate architecture of the unconscious mind, there exists a psychic force that reigns with an eerie quietness, yet commands immense, often unacknowledged power: the internal mother. She does not need to shout to be heard. Her influence governs from the depths. She does not need to strike physically, yet her subtle energies shape our very being. Shi Heng Yi might describe this inner figure as the internalized mother imago, a potent psychic echo of the maternal presence, embedded so deeply within the unconscious that it often evades the light of our conscious awareness for an entire lifetime. Even when the biological mother is long gone through death, physical distance, or profound estrangement, this inner mother lives on, and she persists not as a mere memory, a faded photograph in the album of the mind, but as a living, dynamic, and often autonomous complex. She silently scripts how we think, how we feel, how we choose our partners, our careers, our reactions, and how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. She becomes the invisible monarch of our inner kingdom, constantly whispering into the soul of the adult the messages, beliefs, and emotional patterns that the vulnerable child once absorbed without question, without defense. From our very first breath, the mother, or the primary caregiver who stood in her place, became the first significant mirror through which we glimpsed our nascent sense of self. It was through her gaze. Was it loving, critical, indifferent, or anxious? Through her tone of voice, through her physical embrace, or through her emotional or physical withdrawal, that we learned fundamental lessons about our place in the world. We learned whether we were truly welcome, cherished, and safe, or merely tolerated, a burden, or an inconvenience. Shi Heng Yi's perspective would suggest that these profoundly impactful early impressions are not merely stored as cognitive data in the brain. They are, in a sense, mythologized within the soul. They crystallize into what he might term the mother complex, a constellation of emotionally charged ideas, memories, feelings, and archetypal energies associated with the mother. This psychic constellation then becomes the mother imago, a symbolic inner image that carries immense emotional charge, personal meaning, and often mythic weight, influencing us far more than we realize. And herein lies a significant tragedy, a source of much unconscious suffering. This internalized mother imago is rarely, if ever, an entirely accurate or objective representation of the actual mother. It is not the mother as she truly was, in all her human complexity, with her own history, wounds, and intentions. Instead, it is the mother as we perceived her, filtered through the lens of a child's psyche, a psyche still unformed, developmentally dependent, and often desperately trying to make sense of its experiences and ensure its own survival. If this internal mother, this imago, was predominantly nurturing, attuned to our needs, and emotionally consistent, she becomes an inner wellspring of self-worth, resilience, and a fundamental sense of security that underpins our adult lives. We carry within us a feeling of being lovable, capable, and safe in the world. However, if the mother imago was formed through experiences of absence, rejection, chronic criticism, emotional unavailability, or enmeshment, where boundaries were blurred and the child's individuality was not respected, she transforms into a silent saboteur within the psyche. She becomes a powerful, though often unseen force that insidiously conditions every significant relationship we form, every risk we contemplate taking, every dream we dare to nurture. Her internalized voice may whisper a constant litany of undermining messages. You are too much. You are not enough. Don't speak up. Don't shine too brightly. Stay small. Stay safe. Don't rock the boat. Shi Heng Yi would likely warn that when this internalized, critical, or fearful voice is mistaken for our own true self, for our own inner wisdom, the individual becomes tragically enslaved to a ghost, confusing inherited, often dysfunctional, programming with authentic inner truth. This is the very birthplace of the persistent inner saboteur. It's not mere insecurity or a lack of confidence. It is the deeply internalized criticism, disappointment, or anxiety of a mother who, for her own reasons, once withheld consistent approval, used affection as a tool of control, or was unable to mirror the child's worthiness. This inner mother might appear in the psyche as a nagging echo of disappointment, a relentless command to abandon one's own needs and desires in favor of pleasing others, or a subtle yet pervasive panic that arises whenever we dare to break away from inherited familial roles or societal expectations. Her voice often arises most powerfully during moments of potential expansion, growth, or joy, like an invisible hand pulling us back into the familiar, albeit constricting, prison of self-doubt and limitation. And when this potent internal figure, the mother imago, is not made conscious, when her influence remains unexamined in the shadows of the psyche, Shi Heng Yi's framework would explain that she is inevitably projected outward onto the significant people in our lives, onto lovers, teachers, bosses, friends, and even institutions. Suddenly, we are no longer seeing these individuals for who they truly are in their own right. Instead, we are viewing them and reacting to them through the emotionally charged, often distorted lens of our unmet maternal longings and our unhealed mother wounds. We might unconsciously expect them to heal the wounds they did not cause, to provide the nurturing we missed, or to validate our worth in ways that only we can ultimately do for ourselves. We may react to them with disproportionate fear, intense neediness, or inexplicable rage, triggered by perceived slights or behaviors that resonate with old, unresolved maternal dynamics. We find ourselves chasing the fantasy of finally being chosen, perfectly nurtured, or completely validated, while simultaneously and paradoxically being unconsciously drawn to partners or situations that replicate the very emotional dynamics, be it abandonment, criticism, control, or enmeshment, that we are desperately trying to escape. The unintegrated negative aspects of the mother imago become a powerful filter on our reality, distorting our perceptions and leading to a repeating cycle of confusion, disillusionment, and emotional repetition in our relationships and life choices. In its most destructive and insidious form, the negatively charged internal mother can become a kind of psychic vampire, not in a literal, metaphorical sense, but energetically. She can drain our vitality, our life force. She can suppress our natural instincts, our intuition, our gut feelings. She can cloud our creative fire, making it difficult to access our innate talents and express ourselves authentically. This internal drain can manifest as chronic, unexplained exhaustion, a persistent emotional flatness or numbness, a debilitating fear of choosing boldly or decisively, or an almost paralyzing inability to make significant life decisions without an overwhelming sense of guilt or anxiety. The individual can feel frozen, alive yet profoundly estranged from the vibrant flow of life itself. Shi Heng Yi might see this as a form of inner possession, a kind of psychic colonization where the soul is no longer sovereign, no longer guided by its own authentic impulses, but is instead governed by a frozen, outdated image from the past, a relic of childhood needs and perceptions. And yet, here lies another profound paradox. We often remain fiercely, though unconsciously, loyal to this internal mother imago, even if she wounded us deeply, even if the experiences that formed her were characterized by coldness, cruelty, or neglect. The psyche, in its childlike parts, often clings tenaciously to this inner image, secretly hoping that if we just stay small enough, obedient enough, compliant enough, perhaps even wounded enough, we might finally win her love, her approval, her acceptance. But Shi Heng Yi would likely call this a tragic and ultimately futile illusion. The internal mother imago, as a fixed psychic imprint, is not evolving. She is not the real, living, changing external mother. She is a crystallized pattern of past perceptions and emotional charges. No matter how much we contort ourselves, no matter how much we sacrifice our own needs and desires in an attempt to earn her internalized affection or silence her internalized criticism, we will only sink deeper into self-abandonment, further away from our own authentic core. To truly heal, Shi Heng Yi's perspective would insist we must initiate a conscious, deliberate separation, not necessarily a physical separation from our actual mother, though that may sometimes be necessary for a time, but a profound psychic separation from the inner image, the imago that holds our soul hostage. This means courageously naming the mother complex for what it is, acknowledging its power and its influence. It means facing this inner figure directly, perhaps through methods like active imagination, inner dialogue, dream work, journaling, or symbolic ritual. It requires us to create a safe inner space to allow the exiled feelings, the feelings that were too dangerous or overwhelming to acknowledge in childhood, to finally rise to the surface. The rage, the grief, the profound sense of betrayal, the deep, aching longing for what was missing. It invites us to reclaim the voice we buried long ago, to establish the healthy boundaries we always feared to draw, and to take back the personal power we once surrendered in a desperate attempt to survive emotionally. This profound act of psychic separation is not an act of hateful rebellion. It is, in fact, the sacred journey of individuation, the fundamental inherent right of every soul to exist as a distinct, authentic self, not merely as a shadow or an extension of another. And it is not enough to simply disarm the negative, shadowy aspects of the internal mother. Shi Heng Yi's wisdom would suggest that we must also consciously work to reclaim and cultivate the light, the positive, life-affirming face of the mother archetype within ourselves. This means actively developing our own inner nurturer, our inner protector, our own creative, life-generating force. This doesn't come from wishful thinking, fantasy, or a denial of past pain. It comes from consciously building a new internal relationship with ourselves, one rooted not in scarcity, fear, or conditional worth, but in sovereignty, self-compassion, and inherent value. Through consistent practices like kind, encouraging self-talk, inner rituals of care and self-soothing, connecting with mythic feminine symbols that resonate with strength and wisdom, and engaging in practices of creativity and embodiment, we slowly, patiently begin to mother ourselves. And in doing so, we reclaim the precious parts of our psyche that were once exiled, neglected, or suppressed in the name of survival. Shi Heng Yi might echo a sentiment that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. In the intricate and often challenging realm of the mother complex, that potent darkness frequently resides within the unexamined internal mother, the silent dictator, the inherited critical voice, the ancestral wound passed down through generations. And until we face her, not with hatred or blame, but with courageous clarity, compassion, and a commitment to our own truth, we remain bound, caught in repeating patterns of the past. But once we do undertake this sacred inner work, once we begin to disentangle our true self from the limiting imago, we step into something truly sacred. We begin to live, not as perpetual children forever seeking permission or validation from an external or internalized maternal figure, but as sovereign adults who carry within them both the fierce fire and the profound gentleness of the healed, integrated feminine principle. We no longer wait passively to be chosen, to be loved, to be seen. We actively choose ourselves. We no longer beg for love from others to fill an inner void. We learn to love ourselves into a state of genuine wholeness. And in that courageous, transformative act, the powerful, often crippling spell of the unexamined inner mother begins to break, and a deeper, more authentic, and truly empowered self begins to rise from the ashes of the old. One of the most sacred and often agonizing thresholds in psychological life, as Shi Heng Yi might teach, is the symbolic separation from the mother complex. This is not a simplistic rejection of the mother herself, the woman who raised us, but rather a deep conscious confrontation with the archetypal gravitational field that relentlessly pulls the ego back into states of fusion, dependency, and unconscious loyalty. Without this courageous act of separation, Shi Heng Yi would warn, there can be no true individuation, no fully realized I, no genuinely awakened and self-directed life. This process is less a single social event, like moving out of the family home, and more a profound, ongoing psychic rite of passage, a symbolic death and rebirth often hidden beneath the surface of ordinary adult struggles, with establishing healthy boundaries, forming a solid sense of identity, and finding meaningful purpose. To remain psychically enmeshed with the mother imago, whether through unexamined guilt, persistent idealizing fantasies, or unconscious fear of her disapproval, is to live life behind a veil. It is to act not from a place of genuine self-possession, but from inherited roles: the ever-obedient child, the silent people-pleaser, the internal orphan, forever waiting to be truly seen and validated. Shi Heng Yi might liken this inner severance to a second birth. The first, physical birth, freed the body from the womb. This second, psychological birth, frees the soul from the confines of the internalized mother complex. It is through this, often painful yet ultimately liberating unbinding, that the authentic adult self begins to truly rise, not in angry rebellion, but in profound reverence for what must evolve within us if we are to live fully. Yet, many of us understandably resist this essential rite of passage. The separation, while absolutely crucial for psychological maturity and freedom, is often met with profound, unconscious terror. Shi Heng Yi might identify several powerful forces that bind us to the mother complex, making this separation so challenging. Firstly, the deep-seated fear of annihilation, the child's primal cellular terror that to separate from the mother or her internalized image is, on some fundamental level, to die. Secondly, the crushing guilt of betrayal, a pervasive psychic belief that individuating, becoming our own person, is an act of profound ingratitude or abandonment towards the one who gave us life or cared for us. Thirdly, the deceptive comfort of familiarity, where even a suffocating or painful dynamic can feel safer and more predictable than the unknown territory of true freedom and autonomy. And finally, the cultural scaffolding, the societal narratives and expectations that often elevate familial loyalty and conformity above the sometimes disruptive yet vital call of inner authenticity. These are not mere personal neuroses or individual failings, Shi Heng Yi might emphasize. They are ancient, powerful archetypal currents flowing through the collective unconscious, formidable forces that every human being must, at some point, consciously face if they are to become whole and self-actualized. When this necessary psychological separation is avoided, postponed, or inadequately navigated, the consequences for the individual's life are profound and far-reaching. The child archetype, in essence, hijacks the adult ego. Beneath the often polished surface of outwardly successful lives and high-functioning roles, there frequently lies an inner child who remains unseen, unhealed, and unheard, still pleading silently for permission to be real, to be authentic, to exist on their own terms. These individuals, though inhabiting adult bodies, often find themselves unable to fully claim their inner authority. They may hesitate chronically before taking action, defer important decisions to others, suppress their deepest desires and longings, and live in constant fear of failure, not necessarily because of the practical consequences of failure, but because of what that failure might unconsciously say to the lingering, often critical mother in their mind. In the view of a wisdom teacher like Shi Heng Yi, this state is not simply immaturity, it is a form of psychic captivity, a life lived within invisible, self-imposed, yet powerfully constricting walls. True psychological separation is, in many ways, the hero's or heroine's journey. It is the necessary descent into the dark, often tangled, forest of the unconscious. It is the courageous confrontation with the dragon of the mother's shadow, the part of the maternal archetype that, having once been the protector, can become the jailer, the giver of life who, if her own needs are unfulfilled or her wounds unhealed, can become the devourer of her child's individuality. The path of separation is often littered with intense grief for what was and what could never be, with bewildering confusion as old identities crumble, with righteous rage at past injustices, and with the aching resonant silence of ancestral memory and unfulfilled longing. But to refuse this call, to avoid this challenging inner work, is to risk living a life dictated not by the authentic soul, but by patterns of avoidance, fear, and unconscious repetition. The one who delays this crucial journey risks a life tinged with existential despair, unknowingly and compulsively repeating the unresolved drama of the mother complex in every significant partner they choose, every job they undertake, and every deeply felt yet chronically unmet longing. The ego, as it has been constructed in relation to the mother complex, must, in a symbolic sense, die for the true self to rise. Shi Heng Yi might describe this critical juncture as a psychological crucifixion, the painful death of the compliant, approval-seeking child, the one who once believed deep in their core that love and safety could only be earned through the suppression of their authentic needs and feelings. In its place, if the process is allowed to unfold, the sovereign adult is born. This adult is not necessarily polished, perfect, or free from all pain, but they are grounded, breathing their own air and willing to meet life as it truly is, with all its complexities and uncertainties. This birth, like all significant births, is messy and demands a period of profound mourning. Mourning for the childhood that was never fully lived, mourning for the cherished illusions that must now be shattered, and mourning for the deep, primal longing for ideal maternal connection that must now be faced and integrated rather than perpetually and fruitlessly fed by external sources. Yet, after this symbolic death, after the storm, comes an emptiness, a silence so wide and vast it can initially terrify. This void, Shi Heng Yi might teach, is sacred space. It is the vacuum left behind when the internalized mother's voice, with its criticisms, anxieties, or expectations, no longer fills every corner of the psyche. And this void is dangerous only when we fail to consciously fill it ourselves. If we do not actively claim this newly available inner space with our own authentic values, our own heartfelt desires, and the sound of our own inner voice, the mother's shadow, the old complex, often returns, perhaps stronger, subtler, and even more consuming than before. This is why separation alone is not enough. It must be followed by conscious creation, the intentional building of a new inner structure, a new way of being in the world, one that is not borrowed from past conditioning or inherited from family patterns, but forged from the fires of self-awareness, courage, and authentic choice. When this profound inner shift happens, when the individual courageously crosses the threshold of symbolic separation and begins the work of inner creation, the sovereign ego starts to awaken. This is not the inflated, grandiose ego of superiority or defensiveness, but the stable, resilient ego of genuine self-trust. It is the kind of ego that no longer acts primarily to please others or to perform for external validation, but to authentically express the deep truth of one's own being. This awakened ego no longer makes crucial life decisions out of fear, guilt, or obligation, but from a place of inner alignment and intuitive knowing. It enters into relationships not to be saved, completed, or fixed, but to share its own fullness and to engage in mutual growth. This sovereign ego does not frantically seek certainty in an uncertain world. Instead, it learns to embrace mystery, to tolerate ambiguity, and to find wisdom in the unknown. It does not demand constant applause or external recognition. It honors the integrity of its own voice and the value of its own experience. And underlying this entire transformative process lies a profound spiritual truth. Shi Heng Yi might see the break from the mother complex as more than just a psychological adjustment. It is a spiritual passage. It is the moment we consciously step out of the known world. The mother as collective expectation, the mother as the illusion of ultimate safety, and bravely step into the wild, untamed, and sacred territory of the authentic self. The self in this understanding is not the ego's fleeting fantasy of who we'd like to be, but the deep, abiding inner guide, the core of our being, the force that carries our unique soul's blueprint and continually dares us to fulfill it. When we separate from the restrictive aspects of the mother complex, we are not turning away from love itself. We are turning toward truth, our own deepest truth. And in doing so, we begin to live not as unconscious followers of inherited scripts, but as conscious co-creators of meaning, purpose, and a life that truly reflects who we are. Ritual, in its many forms, can powerfully aid this unfolding. Shi Heng Yi would likely understand that significant psychological thresholds must be marked, honored, and integrated, whether through art, dream work, journaling, conscious movement, or sacred symbolic gestures. We give form to the formless, making the inner shift tangible. We declare, both to ourselves and to the universe, the old way is over, a new way is beginning. We might speak to the mother in our minds, the internalized imago, and say with clarity and compassion, "I honor the life you gave me. I acknowledge your journey, but I no longer belong to your unhealed patterns. I belong to myself." We build altars, not necessarily of stone and candles, but of courageous actions, acts of setting healthy boundaries, moments of radical honesty with ourselves and others, breaths taken deeply without the old, familiar fear of punishment or disapproval. Separation, then, viewed through this lens, is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of profound devotion, devotion to life itself, devotion to the soul's journey, devotion to becoming a vessel wide enough and strong enough to hold both the grief of the past and the immense beauty of what is yet to be. Without this courageous separation, we risk circling the same shadows, repeating the same pains, generation after generation. With it, we begin the sacred walk toward the authentic, individuated self. As Shi Heng Yi might say, humanity's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. And in the labyrinthine depths of the mother complex, the very first doorway to freedom often opens through the brave, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying act of letting go. A core insight from a depth perspective, such as one Shi Heng Yi might offer, is that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will mistakenly call it fate. Nowhere is this truth more starkly apparent than in the silent, often corrosive effects of the unhealed mother wound. When the mother complex, that emotionally charged cluster of experiences, beliefs, and archetypal energies related to the mother, lies dormant and unexamined within the psyche, it does not simply disappear or fade away with time. Instead, it often metastasizes, weaving itself insidiously through every corner of our being. It subtly yet powerfully shapes our core beliefs about ourselves and the world, dictates our habitual behaviors and emotional reactions, and defines the patterns of our most intimate relationships. These are not, as Shi Heng Yi might warn, random misfortunes, isolated personality quirks, or mere bad luck. They are often the recognizable manifestations of deep archetypal patterns, the outward expressions of unresolved psychic energies that have not yet been brought into the healing light of conscious awareness. Let us now explore some of the deeply rooted psychic symptoms that frequently reveal the presence of an unhealed mother wound within the individual. Symptoms that often reach far beyond the purely personal and tap into the very soul of our collective human experience. One of the first and most pervasive signs of an unhealed mother wound is the presence of a relentless, tormenting inner voice that consistently whispers sabotage. You're not good enough. Who do you think you are to try that? You'll never succeed. You're fundamentally flawed. This is no ordinary fleeting self-doubt that everyone experiences from time to time. It is the deeply internalized shadow of the maternal voice, a persistent psychic echo of early life experiences where love may have been conditional, approval consistently withheld, vulnerability met with criticism or punishment, or where the child felt unseen or unheard. Disguised often as logic, realism, or even morality, this inner critic relentlessly punishes the ego for its perceived shortcomings and actively stifles the emerging, authentic self from expressing its potential. Shi Heng Yi might describe this as a powerful complex, an autonomous, emotionally charged fragment of the psyche that acts almost like a parasite, feeding off the ego's attempts to grow, to dare, and to thrive. It keeps the individual locked in a state of chronic self-doubt and fear of judgment. Furthermore, many who carry this unhealed wound find themselves perpetually torn between a deep, yearning longing for freedom and an equally powerful, often paralyzing terror of it. They crave independence, autonomy, and the ability to direct their own lives, yet they can feel utterly paralyzed, anxious, or overwhelmed when faced with the actual prospect of standing alone, making their own decisions, or taking full responsibility for their choices. In this state, decisions, especially significant ones, can feel overwhelmingly dangerous. Success, paradoxically, can feel like a betrayal of the suffering mother image, or a betrayal of the familiar, albeit painful, identity of being the one who struggles. Conversely, failure can, on an unconscious level, become a perverse means of maintaining an invisible loyalty to the mother's suffering or to the established family dynamic. Shi Heng Yi might see this internal conflict as a form of psychological regression, an unconscious retreat into the symbolic arms of the archetypal mother, where a false sense of safety is purchased at the devastating cost of the authentic self and its potential for growth and fulfillment. There often exists a deep, almost sacred, and profoundly irrational guilt in those who consciously or unconsciously attempt to separate from the mother complex and individuate. This guilt doesn't stem from a genuine wrongdoing, but from a deeply ingrained psychic script that insidiously whispers, "If I thrive, I betray her. If I grow and become happy, I abandon her, especially if she was perceived as unhappy or unfulfilled. If I set boundaries, I am ungrateful." This is not personal, rational guilt. It is archetypal, primal. It stems from the primitive, childlike belief that one's very survival, lovability, and goodness are inextricably tied to the mother's emotional state and her approval. Shi Heng Yi might identify this as the child unconsciously and often sacrificially carrying the unlived life of the parent. The mother's regrets, her limitations, her unhealed pain, and her unfulfilled desires can be passed down like an invisible yet immensely heavy psychic inheritance, burdening the child with a sense of responsibility for the mother's happiness that is impossible to fulfill and deeply damaging to their own development. Those wounded by a mother's consistent disapproval, emotional unavailability, or conditional love often become experts in the painful art of self-abandonment. The ego, still unconsciously trained from childhood to appease, to please, and to seek external validation, habitually betrays its own authentic needs, desires, and feelings in a desperate, ongoing attempt to remain good, lovable, or accepted in the eyes of the internalized mother, and by extension, in the eyes of others onto whom this dynamic is projected. Healthy boundaries, in this context, can feel like terrifying threats, acts of aggression, or profound betrayals. Saying no to others' demands or expectations can induce overwhelming shame, anxiety, or a deep fear of rejection or punishment. Shi Heng Yi might interpret this as the ego still wearing the constricting mask of the obedient, compliant child, terrified to risk the imagined wrath or disappointment of the inner mother, and tragically unfamiliar with the sacred authority and wisdom of its own authentic voice and intrinsic needs. Perhaps one of the most painfully evident manifestations of an unhealed mother wound is the recurring pattern where individuals find themselves repeatedly and almost magnetically drawn to partners, friends, or even work situations that eerily resemble the emotional terrain of their original mother wound. They might unconsciously choose emotionally distant, critical, controlling, narcissistic, or smothering partners, replaying the old familiar dynamics with a new cast of characters. This repetition, however, is not mere foolishness or a sign of masochism. From a depth perspective like that of Shi Heng Yi, it can be understood as the psyche's symbolic, unconscious attempt at repair, a desperate effort to finally get it right this time, to heal the original wound by mastering it in a new context. However, Shi Heng Yi would also note that the unconscious, by its very nature, tends to recreate unresolved trauma externally, not to intentionally punish, but in a profound, albeit often misguided, attempt to bring it to conscious awareness and integrate it. But unless we become consciously aware of this powerful projective mechanism and the underlying wound driving it, we tragically mistake repetition for fate, and often we unconsciously call this familiar suffering love because it resonates with our earliest experiences of attachment. At the very core of many unhealed mother wounds lies a pervasive, deeply ingrained belief: I am not enough. This belief becomes the soul's constant, sorrowful background hum, a silent, damning decree often inherited from a mother's perceived neglect, absence, chronic criticism, or impossibly high unreachable standards. This core deficiency belief then manifests in a multitude of ways, as relentless perfectionism, a desperate need for overachievement, often followed by an inability to enjoy any success, chronic shame, an inability to receive compliments or acknowledge one's own strengths, and a persistent difficulty in feeling genuine joy or peace without an accompanying sense of apology or unworthiness. Shi Heng Yi would likely recognize this as the profound, often unspoken cry of the inner child, still waiting to be truly seen, deeply validated, and unconditionally touched by the warmth, acceptance, and mirroring that never consistently came in those crucial early years. The mother archetype, in its fullest expression, is not only a nurturer, but also a potent creator, the source of life and generativity. When that archetype is wounded within an individual's psyche through their experiences with their personal mother, their own innate creativity often becomes constricted, blocked, or even perceived as dangerous. Authentic self-expression can feel profoundly unsafe, fraught with anxiety. The individual may become paralyzed by a fear of judgment, terrified that their unique gifts will be dismissed, their authentic voice silenced, or their inner light rejected, or even punished, just as their early attempts at self-expression might have been. Shi Heng Yi's teachings might suggest that when the devouring, controlling, or critical aspect of the mother archetype, the shadow mother, dominates the psyche, the individual unconsciously learns to fear that to truly shine, to be fully themselves, is to provoke abandonment, envy, or worse, retaliation from this powerful inner figure. Thus, their creative life force remains tragically suppressed. What the conscious mind represses, the body often expresses. Shi Heng Yi might observe that unresolved psychological complexes, particularly one as fundamental as the mother complex, frequently manifest as somatic, physical symptoms. Chronic fatigue, persistent anxiety disorders, unexplained physical pain, digestive issues, autoimmune disorders, and disordered eating patterns can, in many cases, reflect the deep, unconscious split between the need to be nurtured and the fear of being consumed, or the body's protest against the suppression of authentic feelings and needs. These are not always random ailments or purely biological malfunctions. They can be understood as the body's symbolic language, its desperate cry for attention, healing, and reconciliation between the wounded, alienated ego and the forgotten, neglected needs of the inner child and the soul. Finally, at the very center of the unhealed mother wound often lies a profound void, a spiritual hollowness, a painful sense that the vital connection to the healthy feminine principle, to the great mother archetype in her life-affirming aspect, has been severed or distorted. The individual may feel spiritually orphaned, perpetually adrift, forever searching for something they cannot quite name, a sense of belonging or meaning that always seems just out of reach. They might relentlessly chase external approval, worldly success, intense experiences, or fleeting moments of ecstasy, but nothing ever truly or lastingly satisfies the deep hunger within. Shi Heng Yi might see this as the soul's profound aching hunger for reconnection with the archetypal mother in her positive form, the lost source of unconditional love, innate wisdom, intuitive guidance, and a deep, abiding sense of inner belonging and peace. The varied and often debilitating symptoms of the unhealed mother wound are not, it is crucial to understand, signs of personal weakness, inherent defectiveness, or moral failing. They are messages. They are cries from the soul indicating that something essential has been lost, ignored, wounded, or buried deep within the unconscious. Shi Heng Yi would not teach us to blame our mothers endlessly, for they too were often products of their own conditioning and unhealed wounds. Instead, the wisdom lies in learning to courageously retrieve our projections, to compassionately face what we have exiled within ourselves, and to diligently reclaim the fullness of our own being. Healing does not mean erasing the painful past. It means learning how to hold it with awareness and compassion, without being perpetually held hostage by its unconscious power. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will indeed direct your life, and you will call it fate. In the profound and often challenging realm of the mother wound, this is not merely a metaphor, it is a map, and the transformative path begins not with blame, but with unflinching awareness, not with bitter rebellion, but with courageous reclamation. The child who who was never truly seen, validated, or allowed to be themselves, must now become the conscious adult who chooses, with unwavering commitment, to see, validate, and liberate themselves. That is precisely where true healing begins. That is where authentic freedom is finally born. Within the sacred and transformative structure of depth psychology, as a thinker like Shi Heng Yi might articulate it, the conscious confrontation with the shadow mother is not merely a therapeutic technique. It is a soul-deep initiation, a necessary passage for anyone who truly seeks wholeness. Shi Heng Yi would not consider this challenging encounter optional for those on the path of individuation. He would likely deem it absolutely vital. Healing the profound mother wound is not achieved through intellectual insight alone, however brilliant, nor through polite, superficial forgiveness offered from the defensive surface of the ego. It demands a raw, courageous, and symbolic descent into the often daunting underworld of the psyche. It requires a profound reckoning with the archetypal mother's shadow, her consuming, controlling, or wounded aspects, an encounter as ancient as myth itself and as intimately personal as your own heartbeat. In the symbolic language of alchemy, which often parallels the processes of psychological transformation Shi Heng Yi might describe, the nigredo, or the blackening, marks the crucial first stage of transformation. It is the death of illusion, the dissolving of cherished fantasies. For the child self still psychically trapped in the mother complex, this is the pivotal moment when the sweet, often idealized veil of the all-good mother dissolves, and what emerges from the depths is something darker, more challenging, and often terrifying, the devouring, engulfing, or neglecting aspect of the archetypal feminine. Shi Heng Yi would likely teach that this darkness, this shadow, is not inherently evil. It is in fact sacred in its potential. It contains the lost, smoldering fire of the authentic self, the power that was suppressed, the voice that was silenced. The shadow mother, in all her perceived terror, paradoxically holds the very ingredients necessary for our liberation, our creativity, and the reclaiming of our personal power. She is the formidable gatekeeper of a precious treasure that has been buried deep beneath layers of fear, guilt, and conditioning. The very act of seeing her clearly, without illusion, is the first courageous step toward integration. Individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole and distinct self, truly begins the moment you dare to see her, to see the shadow mother clearly without the distortions of idealization or the blanket of denial. This is the soul's first act of authentic rebellion and profound reclamation. It requires the immense courage to recognize her subtle or overt manipulations, to acknowledge her own, often projected fear of abandonment, to see her unconscious need to possess or control, and to understand the painful way she may have projected her own unhealed pain, limitations, or unfulfilled desires onto you, the child. As long as we unconsciously preserve the comforting but ultimately stultifying fantasy of the ever-giving, ever-sacrificing, perfectly good mother, we remain psychically bound in the psyche's childhood, unable to step into the sacred authority and responsibility of the adult self. Buried deep beneath years, perhaps decades, of conditioned obedience, compliance, and people-pleasing, often lies a vast reservoir of unprocessed rage. And beneath that volcanic rage, there is an ocean of profound grief. Shi Heng Yi would likely emphasize that these powerful emotions are not pathologies to be suppressed or medicated away. They are sacred energies, fragmented and exiled parts of the soul, banished into the shadows by guilt, fear, or the simple need to survive an emotionally untenable childhood. To truly heal, one must create the space to acknowledge, feel, and express the righteous fury of betrayal, the deep ache of not being truly seen or validated, the profound sorrow for a mother who, for whatever reasons, could not nurture or protect as the child's soul so desperately required. This grief is not a regression into childishness. It is a resurrection of feeling, a reclaiming of emotional truth. Through conscious expression, perhaps through therapeutic work, ritual, art, writing, movement, or even through silent, heartfelt tears, We make sacred space for the soul's return, for the integration of these long-lost parts of ourselves. The method of active imagination, or a similar introspective dialogue process that Shi Heng Yi might advocate, serves as a powerful bridge between the conscious, everyday mind and the autonomous, often symbolic, figures of the unconscious. Through this practice, we can enter into a living, dynamic dialogue with the inner shadow mother. The aim is not to battle her, to defeat her, or to obliterate her, but to truly hear her voice, to understand her motivations from her perspective. She may reveal her own deep-seated fear, her envy, her profound sorrow, her unacknowledged losses, or the heavy burdens she herself carried. And through this courageous and compassionate conversation, the ego, our sense of self, begins to transform. It shifts from being a perpetually needy child, craving approval or fearing punishment, into an aware adult capable of listening with empathy, speaking its own truth with clarity, and standing with inner sovereignty, even in the face of challenging inner and outer dynamics. The false, simplistic split of all good or all bad mother begins to dissolve, and a more complex, nuanced, and ultimately whole picture starts to emerge. Wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. This profound inner confrontation and dialogue invariably marks a symbolic death. Not the death of the physical mother, but the death of the psychic prison that her internalized image may still represent within us. This phase can be tumultuous. Nightmares, emotional storms, a crumbling of old, cherished beliefs, and a sense of profound disorientation often accompany this symbolic death. But in the mythopoetic lens that a teacher like Shi Heng Yi might use, this death is profoundly sacred. It mirrors the archetypal myth of the hero or heroine descending into the underworld, courageously facing the dragon, which often symbolizes the mother shadow, and eventually rising, reborn, and transformed. What truly dies is not the mother, but the ego's limiting illusions and childlike dependencies. What is born is the soul's hard-won freedom. The shadow mother, in her negative manifestation, does not only wound the heart, she often deeply wounds the feminine principle within us, regardless of our gender. Our intuition, our capacity for softness and receptivity, our ability to experience uninhibited joy, our connection to our sensuality, our trust in the flow of life. All these aspects of the healthy feminine can be constricted or distorted when we fear or resent the mother imago. When we are afraid of the internalized mother, we often become afraid of these vital, life-affirming parts in ourselves. But the process of integration brings reunion. As we heal the mother wound, we begin to trust the inner knowing, the subtle intuitive whispers that we once silenced or dismissed. We learn to express our emotions authentically, without shame or apology. We dare to create, to feel, to love, not as a dependent child needing constant permission or validation, but as a sovereign soul remembering and reclaiming its inherent right to exist fully and vibrantly. Shi Heng Yi might see this as an essential aspect of healing, especially in cultures that have historically repressed or devalued the feminine archetype and its profound wisdom. Transformation of this magnitude must be marked. The psyche needs and responds to ritual. Symbolic acts, however simple, can have profound power. Writing unsent letters to the mother imago, pouring out all the unsaid words, and then perhaps burning them in a private ceremony. Creating art that expresses the journey of pain, release, and emerging freedom. Consciously declaring one's sovereignty and independence in a sacred personal space. All these acts signal to the deep unconscious that something fundamental has shifted, that a new chapter has begun. Shi Heng Yi would likely believe that rituals serve as powerful thresholds. They mark the symbolic death of the old, wounded self and the conscious birth of the individuated, more whole one. They whisper to the shadow mother within, "Your restrictive reign is over. I honor what was, I acknowledge your part in my story, but I no longer belong to your unhealed patterns. I belong to myself." And when the deep, often arduous work of facing and integrating the shadow mother is done with courage and sincerity, something truly remarkable often happens. The mother, whether the internal imago or the external person, is no longer perceived as either an omnipotent goddess to be worshipped or a monstrous demon to be endlessly blamed. She begins to become human, wounded, yes, flawed, certainly, but human, with her own story, her own limitations, her own struggles. Shi Heng Yi might teach that true, authentic compassion, not a forced or sentimental pity, but a deep, seeing compassion, emerges not from a sense of obligation or a desire to be good, but from profound insight and self-awareness. This genuine compassion does not excuse or condone any harm that was done. Rather, it frees the individual's heart from the heavy chains of bitterness, resentment, and perpetual victimhood. It allows the soul to breathe again, unchained from the past and reconnected to the flowing river of life. To courageously face the shadow mother is to consciously descend into the hidden cave where your deepest fear and your greatest freedom dwell side by side, often intertwined. It is not ultimately an act of violence or aggression towards the mother figure. It is an act of profound devotion, devotion to your own truth, devotion to your soul's unfolding, devotion to life itself in all its complexity. Shi Heng Yi might call this sacred journey individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the whole, unique, and authentic self you were always meant to be. It often begins with a painful rupture of old illusions, passes through the purifying fires of grief and rage, and culminates in a quiet, profound rebirth. There is no coming to consciousness without pain, Shi Heng Yi might remind us. But beyond the pain, if we persevere, lies our freedom. The freedom to live not in constant reaction to the past, but in conscious service to the evolving self. The freedom to love, not from a place of lack and desperate need, but from a wellspring of inner fullness. The freedom ultimately to live and to die, not as someone's perpetual child, forever defined by that primary relationship, but as your own sovereign, individuated soul. In the sacred language of depth psychology, as interpreted by a thinker like Shi Heng Yi, forgiveness is not necessarily the ultimate crown of healing the mother wound, but rather a delicate shadow that may or may not quietly follow the much deeper, more essential light of inner transformation and self-reclamation. Shi Heng Yi would likely not place forgiveness at the absolute center of the individuation process, for he would know that no authentic, profound healing truly begins with a sense of moral obligation, societal pressure, or as a performance for others. Instead, he would teach that the true transformative path begins with something far more challenging, yet ultimately more rewarding: the courageous, unflinching descent inward. It requires us to face without flinching the full, often painful reality of the wound, especially when that wound was carved, however unintentionally, by the very hands that were meant to hold us, nurture us, and keep us safe. If forgiveness ever authentically arises on this journey, Shi Heng Yi might insist it must not be manufactured, forced, or prematurely adopted. It is not a ceremony performed for the benefit of others, nor is it a badge of supposed spiritual superiority or healedness. Rather, if genuine forgiveness appears, it is often the quiet, unforced, and natural consequence of deep soul retrieval. That moment when the individual has courageously reclaimed their psychic authority, integrated their fragmented parts, and no longer requires external resolution, apology, or change from the other person in order to feel whole, peaceful, and free within themselves. Forgiveness, if and when it appears in this organic way, is a byproduct of integration, not a prerequisite for liberation. Shi Heng Yi might caution that premature forgiveness, offered before the wound has been fully acknowledged, felt, and understood, often becomes a subtle form of psychological bypass, a spiritual or emotional sedative offered in place of the necessary, purifying inner fire of transformation. We are often taught, especially within certain spiritual and religious systems, that forgiveness equates to virtue and is a hallmark of healing. But when forgiveness is offered too quickly, when it emerges from underlying guilt, a sense of religious duty, societal expectation, or the fear of being seen as unhealed or bitter, it can become yet another subtle mask worn over unacknowledged rage, profound sorrow, and deep betrayal. In this form, such forgiveness often serves to protect the mother complex, keeping the old dynamics subtly in place. It is not true liberation. It is often a more sophisticated form of suppression. Before true, deep-rooted healing can take root, something far more raw, more primal, and more authentic must be honored. The voice that was silenced for years must be allowed to speak. The anger that was shamed or dismissed must be validated and safely expressed. The profound grief that was denied or minimized must be deeply felt and mourned. The abandoned child within, who waited and longed and was never truly or consistently seen, must finally be acknowledged and compassionately embraced by the adult self. Shi Heng Yi would likely believe that to truly feel these buried truths, to allow these exiled emotions to surface and be processed, is not a regression into immaturity. It is in fact a profound revolution of the self, a reclaiming of one's own emotional reality. The individual must be allowed to grieve the mother they never had, the ideal they longed for. They must, in a safe and contained way, allow themselves to feel the rage against the control that may have suffocated their becoming, or the neglect that left them feeling empty. And they must mourn the years that may have been sacrificed in unconscious loyalty to an illusion or a dysfunctional family pattern. This is not ultimately an attack on the actual mother. It is the sacred emancipation of the individual soul from the chains of the past. Healing truly begins when the mother, both the internal imago and the external person, is no longer frozen in myth, neither as a perfect angel nor as an absolute monster, but is seen with clarity, compassion, and realism, as she was and is, a fallible, often wounded, complex human being. This courageous act of humanization, of seeing her in her full humanity, collapses the powerful projections that once inflated her power over us and dismantles the rigid psychic structures that kept the self imprisoned in old roles and reactions. In this space of newfound clarity, after the emotional storm has passed, after the necessary rupture with old illusions, the genuine possibility of authentic forgiveness may emerge. But even then, Shi Heng Yi might stress, it must come not from a sense of obligation or as a means to an end, but from the deeply rooted strength and compassion of a sovereign, individuated heart. Still, even in the absence of a feeling of forgiveness towards the other, freedom is possible. And this is the crucial, often overlooked insight. Shi Heng Yi might insist that forgiveness of the other is not an absolute requirement for one's own liberation from the mother wound. What is absolutely required is integration within oneself. The individual must consciously gather the fragmented pieces of their soul that were long exiled, their authentic voice, their true feelings, their righteous anger, their capacity for softness and joy, and bring them back into conscious everyday life. They must learn to draw and maintain healthy boundaries, not as an act of punishment towards the mother, but as a sacred act of reclaiming and protecting the inner landscape that was once ruled or encroached upon by her internalized image or her external influence. The ultimate goal is not necessarily reconciliation with the external mother, though that may sometimes be a beautiful outcome. It's not the primary aim of this deep inner work. The ultimate goal is individuation, becoming a whole, authentic, and self-governing individual. And when the individual courageously and consistently walks that challenging path of self-reclamation, the inherited scripts of guilt, obligation, and unhealthy identification begin, slowly but surely, to dissolve. In the profound psychology that Shi Heng Yi might espouse, forgiveness is not the finish line one must cross to prove healing. It is perhaps more like a single leaf that may or may not fall gently from the tree once the roots of the authentic self have grown deep, strong, and secure. The true journey is not primarily directed toward reconciliation with another, but toward the profound restoration of inner authority, self-possession, and soul integrity. It is the quiet, internal revolution of no longer editing your truth to earn love or avoid conflict. It is the courageous act of no longer muting your instincts or suppressing your needs to preserve a fragile connection. It is the liberating choice to no longer shrink yourself to maintain the illusion of peace in a dysfunctional system. Shi Heng Yi might quote a wisdom saying, "Only the one who can consciously assent to the power of the shadow within themselves can truly overcome its negative hold." In the challenging realm of the mother complex, this means no longer waiting for an external act of forgiveness, either given or received, to set you free. It means you rise, you reclaim, you choose with every conscious breath to free yourself. Not later, not when it feels perfectly safe, but now. In the profound realm of depth psychology, as a sage like Shi Heng Yi might illuminate, the healing of the mother wound is not merely the culmination of a process, it is the sacred, transformative crossing into a fundamentally new way of life. It marks not just the resolution of past pain, but the symbolic, alchemical death of the self who was predominantly shaped by survival strategies, by learned silence, by enmeshment, or by the heavy weight of inherited sorrow. And in that psychological death, a profound rebirth begins, the emergence of a self no longer tethered to restrictive ancestral roles or invisible, unconscious loyalties, but grounded firmly in the sovereignty and authenticity of the true, individuated self. Shi Heng Yi would likely teach that only through conscious confrontation with the wound, deep mourning for what was lost or never received, and diligent inner integration of the mother complex can we take our first truly authentic steps into psychological wholeness and genuine adulthood. This is no ordinary superficial healing. It is a metamorphosis of the soul, the courageous dissolution of the false self that was constructed in response to early relational deficits. As the often suffocating grip of the unhealed mother complex begins to loosen, the very scaffolding of the ego, the personality structure that was built upon strategies of pleasing others, performing for approval, and unconsciously preserving the family myth, however dysfunctional, starts to fracture and crumble. Shi Heng Yi might warn that this profound unraveling often arrives cloaked in crisis. It can feel like an identity collapse, where former values and beliefs seem hollow or meaningless, where a clear sense of direction disappears, and where the familiar center of one's being no longer holds. But this sacred disorientation, however unsettling, is the nigredo of the alchemical journey, that essential blackening phase in which the old, outmoded structures must dissolve completely to make way for the emergence of the hidden gold, the authentic self that lies buried beneath. In the fertile void left behind by this dissolution, something deeper, truer, and far more resilient begins to stir: the ascent of the sovereign self. What emerges from this challenging psychic underworld, if the journey is seen through, is not the wounded child returned to a slightly less painful state, but the authentic adult born anew. No longer unconsciously orbiting the mother's imagined or real gaze, no longer living in reaction to her approval or disapproval, this reborn self is guided not by pervasive guilt, unmet longing, or fear of abandonment, but by a deep sense of inner alignment, intuitive wisdom, and authentic values. This reborn individual no longer primarily seeks rescue, validation, or completion from external sources. They learn, often for the first time, to truly parent themselves with compassion, wisdom, and consistency. They consciously choose presence over performance, authenticity over artifice, and they begin to walk through the world not with a chronic sense of apology or unworthiness, but with a quiet, grounded authority that emanates from within. Shi Heng Yi might name this the awakening of the sovereign within, the self that lives from its own authentic center, guided by its own inner truth. This profound transformation of identity requires the courageous unraveling of an inherited, often deeply unconscious script. The old, limiting narrative: I must sacrifice myself to be worthy. I am never enough unless I earn love and approval. My needs don't matter. It's not safe to be truly me, must be painstakingly unbound from the psyche. In its place, a new, empowering myth begins to emerge, one written not in bitter reaction to the mother's pain or limitations, but in profound reverence for one's own soul's truth and inherent worth. Shi Heng Yi would likely consider this inner revision, this rewriting of one's core narrative, a sacred right and a profound responsibility. The individual consciously stepping out of a potentially multi-generational family tragedy and courageously becoming the author of a new symbolic life. one that is more aligned with their deepest potential. With this powerful emergence of the authentic self comes the absolute necessity of establishing and maintaining clear, healthy boundaries, not as acts of punishment or aggression towards others, but as essential acts of self-protection and self-definition. The external mother, if she is still present in one's life, must be met with newfound clarity, consistency, and a firm yet compassionate refusal to re-engage in old, dysfunctional patterns. The internal mother, her lingering voice of shame, fear, criticism, or guilt must be consistently recognized, compassionately understood, and gently but firmly disempowered. Shi Heng Yi would likely emphasize that healthy boundaries are not severances of love, but rather courageous declarations of selfhood. They are the vital psychic lines that guard the emerging adult from regression into old, childlike patterns, and that honor and protect the hard-earned, precious terrain of the individuated self. A profound and healing shift occurs when the lifelong, often desperate, need for external maternal nurturance is consciously withdrawn from others and lovingly rerouted inward into the fertile ground of one's own being. Here, the archetypal inner mother is actively reclaimed, not as the internalized voice of judgment or criticism, but as the gentle, wise whisper of intuition, the capacity for profound softness and self-care, and the unwavering fount of inner strength. Self-parenting becomes a living daily ritual. Rest becomes sacred, not a luxury. Emotional expression is honored without apology or shame. Shi Heng Yi would likely understand this as the vital reintegration of the healthy feminine principle within, where being is no longer seen as weakness or passivity, but as a profound form of wisdom in motion, a necessary counterbalance to relentless doing. Once freed from the mother's unconscious or conscious dominion, and from the constricting grip of the internalized mother complex, the soul often begins to flower again in unexpected and beautiful ways. The creative force, which may have been long paralyzed by fear of judgment, criticism, or rejection, begins to move with newfound freedom and vitality. This creative renewal may emerge as inspired words, vivid visions, healing touch, expressive movement, innovative ideas, or simply a more joyful and engaged way of being in the world. Shi Heng Yi might believe that this resurgence of creative energy is not mere decoration or a pleasant side effect of healing. It is powerful evidence that the process of individuation is taking root and flourishing. For to create, in its broadest sense, is to claim authorship of your life, to act not from a place of deep wounding and reactivity, but from a wellspring of wonder, curiosity, and authentic self-expression. Shi Heng Yi might teach that genuine individuation is never, at its core, a self-centered or narcissistic endeavor. In fact, it prepares the individual to return to the collective, to their relationships and to the world, not as a fractured, needy child, perpetually seeking healing or validation from others, but as a more whole, grounded adult who can genuinely offer presence, wisdom, compassion, and authentic love. Relationships, as a result, transform. They are no longer primarily unconscious reenactments of past loss, deprivation, or enmeshment, but become vessels for genuine reciprocity, mutual respect, and shared growth. Purpose shifts from being a desperate channel for gaining approval or proving worth to becoming an authentic avenue for meaningful contribution and service to something larger than oneself. This is the matured self, standing firmly in the world, without shame, without apology, and with the capacity to truly connect. Perhaps one of the most miraculous and far-reaching aspects of this profound journey, as Shi Heng Yi might see it, is that the healing of one's own mother wound becomes a transgenerational act of love and liberation. To courageously confront, process, and integrate this fundamental wound is to interrupt a potentially ancient ancestral pattern of pain and dysfunction. No longer is the mother's and grandmother's and so on unhealed pain unconsciously passed on to the next generation. Instead, the healed individual becomes a conscious ancestor, a pattern breaker, one who returns symbolically not to rescue the mother from her own journey, but to redeem the entire lineage from the perpetuation of suffering. This is the deeper, often unspoken offering of this challenging work, to be the one who, through their own courageous healing, ends the spell of unconscious repetition and births a new legacy of wholeness, creativity, emotional intelligence, and genuine freedom for generations to come. Rebirth, in the profound psychology that Shi Heng Yi might articulate, is not about somehow becoming who you were before the pain, as if the wound could simply be erased. It is about courageously awakening to the undeniable truth of who you were always meant to be beneath the layers of conditioning and adaptation. It is the quiet, yet profoundly radical, rebellion against inherited guilt, unconscious loyalties, and oppressive familial shadows. It is the sacred, empowering act of taking the pen of your life story back into your own hands. As Shi Heng Yi might powerfully state or echo from ancient wisdom, your vision will become clear only when you learn to look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakes. And in the challenging, often tumultuous aftermath of confronting and integrating the mother wound, awakening means this: no one else is coming to rescue you or to rewrite your story, because now, with newfound clarity and strength, you are the author, and the blank page before you is filled with limitless, sacred potential. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home? Or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, consider sharing this message with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for the sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital, life-affirming union we will ever form is the one with our own authentic inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the subtle whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship, every challenge is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future explorations, please leave it below. This space breathes and evolves because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this message, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this: when the right person appears in your life, your soul will know, not through anxiety or fear, but through a profound sense of peace and resonance. But until that moment, and even after, let your most intimate, cherished, and cultivated relationship be the one you nurture within yourself. That is the unwavering foundation. That is the true home. And from that bedrock of wholeness, all things real, authentic, and lasting are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.